speaking today about the impact. Can you hear me in the back? No, I'll be speaking today about the impacts of two land administration projects on indigenous groups in northern Guatemala, primarily the Quechua Maya, with whom I've worked as a cultural anthropologist over the last 20 years. To give you some context, here we are in Guatemala. This region to the north is the Petén, the northern third of the country, was depopulated during the Spanish colonial period, reforested, and became a haven for Quechua Maya groups who migrated into the frontier, fleeing Spanish rule, coffee plantations, effects of the Civil War, and so on. So here we can see Quechua territory also expands into southern Belize. They are Guatemala's second largest indigenous group, about 1 million speakers. After the CIA orchestrated coup of 1954, their lowland territory became the focus of state-led colonization projects, like in many areas of Latin America, in which frontiers were open in order to avoid agrarian reform elsewhere in the country. And so landless settlers and particularly cattle ranchers moved into the area, and you can see the tremendous population growth in the region, but also the tremendous growth in cattle. Because ecological problems are often blamed on peasants, but it's the cattle ranchers that are pushing them into marginal areas. So more than 50% of this region was deforested in 3 decades, which led to the creation of the Maya Biosphere Reserve in 1992 and a whole series of protected, very ambitious protected areas in this region. As you can see, when they were constituted, they overlapped in previous areas of frontier allotment. So these buffer zones had indigenous groups and peasants on them that already had legalization papers in process with colonization agencies. So inherent conflict from the very beginning in the creation of protected areas. So starting in the 1990s, a series of donors, CARE, supported by Austria, the IDB, Germans, and the Guatemalan government, began a series of land titling projects, primarily in the buffer zones, to clarify tenure and to, with the hopes of stabilizing the agricultural frontier and preventing people from moving further into the parks, and hopefully catalyzing positive environmental behavior, long-term things like agroforestry, changes in land use. And around this time was the signing of the peace accords in 1996 nationally in Guatemala, which made a series of very important agrarian commitments. Public financing for land, credit support for small farmers, training, legal reform, land taxes, out of which the bank plucked the line item of the cadastral registry as and effectively made it the #1 agrarian priority in Guatemala through a $31 million loan it made to the National Cadastral Registry, formerly UTJ. And the first pilot program, the phase 1, was carried out in Petén between 1998 and 2003, extended to 2007, in which no indigenous peoples participation plan was conducted, even though over 40% of the population is indigenous. And I have this slide here because I want you to note that even before this project was evaluated, the bank had approved a second loan to expand the project southward into the rest of Quechua territory and other areas of Guatemala. It's an ongoing project, subject to multiple delays and troubles. The Petén project as well was subject to multiple legal conundrums. It deviated into urban titling. A baseline study was never carried out. Some 6 task managers cycled through the project, so there was little accountability. And even when measured against the barest technical indicators, the project only managed to complete 68% of the cadastral goals and less than 10% of the legalization goals that they had set out. In the second project, now there was a hastily conducted indigenous peoples participation plan based on a series of half-day workshops with Maya groups at the Quechua workshop, who got the same half morning as everyone else, even though they were 70% of the population of the target region. Leaders actually refused to provide feedback because they felt it wasn't a serious consultative process. And because Maya leaders perceive of themselves as not as decision makers, but as spokespeople for the community. So at the very least, you should have 2 meetings so that communities can come back with comments from their representative groups. So here you can see in the appendices, I mean, you just go through the old bank documents, it's very clear the problems that were involved in the project. So there was a growing number of academic and NGO studies that this land titling effort was very quickly catalyzing land sales across the region. Here's a sampling of thumbnails of those books, NGO reports, even an internal evaluation group report here done by the bank, a recent study by the FAO, which seemed to have little influence on the design of the second phase of the project. I somehow convinced the task manager for the second phase of the project that it would be useful to get some hard data on land sales and other outcomes of the project. And so in 2011 and 12, we conducted a multidisciplinary field-based study carried out by Guatemalan social scientists, very different than the typical bank evaluation of international consultants who fly in and out. And of particular concern was the issue of land sales, but we also examined a whole series of other project suppositions that land titling would lead to enhanced access to credit and therefore more environmentally positive behaviors and many other suppositions that I don't have time to get into here, but I can come back to in the questions. So we did a lot of data crunching with databases that no one had ever analyzed. But because land sales are not often registered in the property registry, it was important that we go to the community level and conduct surveys, but also participatory mapping with communities about what had happened over the past 5 years. So in the communities, overlaying orthophotos with the cadastral maps created by the project, which communities had never seen. They were shocked. So they had never, after a multi-million-dollar project, even been given a basic copy of their community map. So they demarcated what they perceived to be their community at the time of mapping, and then marked in red the lands that had been sold in the past 5 years, and green what was still part of the community. So some maps looked like this, partially sold. Quite a few came back like this, virtually disappeared. In fact, 12 Kekchi communities have disappeared from the map in Petén, and I use that language very consciously because peasant leaders are describing their land dispossession in the terms of the Guatemalan genocide, the civil war in which they described themselves as being disappeared. All right, so we took this, moved it back into the databases, did calculations, and then had an extensive vetting process requested of us by the bank, with the Guatemalan government, public forums, advisory council feedback, 2 government comment periods, a quality enhancement review. This was a very tightly vetted report. And published in the last year. I'm happy to provide PDFs to anyone who's interested. I want to talk specifically, I mean, there are many topics we addressed in the report, but I want to focus here on outcomes for Kekchi communities. First, the question of land grabs. So we found that 46% of smallholders had sold or been forced to sell their land within 5 years close of project. And there was very little variability between Kekchi and Ladino communities, except that Kekchi communities tended to be more targeted, 100% by African palm, because their areas of historic migration happened to coincide with soils targeted for African palm development. Some of these are voluntary, sale of land to pay for a child's education or to cover a medical emergency, but increasingly, and in some cases, quite a number of foreclosures from credit provided after the project gave tenure security to peasants very quickly lost that land. It's very hard for poor people to hold on to land, but increasingly a very violent sale of land in which henchmen for the narco ranchers and African palm plantations say to peasants, you know, you can sell me your land today for this much, or your widow will sell it to me next week for much cheaper. That said, I still think there are many remediable aspects the project could have been improved, and that land sales are not inevitable. The narco problem is significant, but there are many steps that could be taken to curb land sales in other contexts. Here, I'll just briefly say that overall, the project had the effect of even though the peace accords stated that indigenous communities should have an opportunity to rectify historical inequities, that there should be active redistribution of land by the state, this project took a very technical approach of just measuring the land as is. So this is kind of the agrarian structure of Petén during colonization. You can see the very large ranches awarded to military officers and political cronies here, and the Quechua settlement regions in which parcels were roughly half the size given to those of Ladinos, and are so small that the lines of their parcels blend into kind of a solid block of gray. And then this is the current agrarian structure, in which you can see a clear process of subdivision, but those ranches have largely remained intact.